Michael, with you and what has happened with Donald Trump and his sort of policies in Central Asia. He's talking about, Donald Trump says that he's going to reconquer the heartland, Central Asia. Really? What's going on, in your opinion, when it comes? He's talking about the investment, $35 billion to Uzbekistan, and they're talking about Kazakhstan, and maybe the base is going back to these countries. What is the importance of the Central Asia, in your opinion, Mike?
Well, the ostensible aim that he's talked about is having American companies invest in tungsten and rare earths. Kazakhstan has very heavy tungsten holds, and America thinks that it can replace reliance on China for tungsten. And the dream of Trump, the almost obsession, is rare earths. But I just don't see Kazakhstan being really much of a source of rare earths. The American oil companies have invested heavily in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and it was a disaster. It was called ecocide. The oil workers' unions all rose up and fought against it, and there's a very strong anti-American feeling, certainly against American mining companies and oil companies throughout Central Asia. And that's basically what Trump is going to be fighting about. And he's hoping that the financing for this is not going to come from the US government. It's going to come from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And they were who originally brought neoliberalism to Kazakhstan and Central Asia, and it was a disaster. What happened in Central Asia is pretty much what happened in the Baltics. Local kleptocracies took over. They registered the property in their own names. They made deals with the Western companies for payoffs and kept their money in the West. They took all of the best housing for themselves, and the IMF and the World Bank introduced the rule of law, meaning that it enabled the governments to foreclose on debtors, people who bought their houses on credit, and their microcredit was the big thing that was sponsored by the Americans and the IMF, by the neoliberals. It worked mainly through women, because you could bring social pressure on the women to repay all of the debts. And the suicide rates went up. And so the women actually led the opposition to the Western influence throughout Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and the other countries there. And so the original reaction against the Soviet Union has given way now to a general feeling that things were much better back then. At least people had security of their housing. There wasn't the polarization, and there wasn't a wealthy billionaire class that has emerged in these countries, and nepotism by the rulers of these countries to their own personal families. It's really back to the 19th century in a way. So what we're seeing is it's more about minerals now. The 19th century, it was more about crops and opium and things like that. But all of this is really just a replay of what was called the Great Game, or the British called it the Eastern Question, the long fight between Britain and Russia, and now the United States against Russia and China for control of everything from Iran all the way across Central Asia to the Uyghur sections of Western China. So you're seeing this geopolitical game with mining companies playing the role, and the mining companies are probably the most unpopular countries in the entire region there. So that we haven't heard a word about what China and Russia are doing, and I think they're just letting America try to play its cards. But last week, the Kazakhstan foreign minister was in Washington trying to talk up Kazakhstan as a to make deals. And that seems to certainly the existing government is trying to make a deal that's going to benefit it all. And I think the deal they met with the Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick, who had negotiated a deal for the Kazakhstan railways before. And there's now a proposal between the Kovkaz, a capital fund, to invest in mining and some kind of profit sharing agreement with Kazakhstan that may not know all the intricacies of the Hollywood accounting that doesn't really leave many profits to be shared after paying all of the interest charges and management charges and other charges that are all put down. So the tension, the great game now is between neoliberal mining interests and what the Kazakhstan people are calling ecocide, destruction of the environment from all of the pollution and the spills that the oil companies have called, and China's Belt and Road Initiative on quite different terms and with a different philosophy from neoliberalism. So it's not only a geopolitical game now, it's a game between what kind of economic arrangements are going to be made. Will they be those of more or less socialist type BRICS arrangements, or will they be the neoliberal arrangements that the United States is trying to push right now?
Richard,
Yeah,
jump in.
I would add two dimensions to it. One, this strikes me as stunningly a replay of 19th and 20th century imperialism. This is Western countries, in this case the United States, seeing the opportunity for profit by either mining, which is as old as imperialism, that goes back to gold and silver and all the other things that have been luring Europeans to go all over the world looking for places where they can get it cheaply or steal it or whatever is necessary, because it is so nicely liquid for them to use in the way they want. Sure, add tungsten, add rare earths. It was always shifting with the technologies that we have available, which determine which resource under the ground is more extractively interesting for profit than the other. So now there's these new ones, and now there's a new place to go get them. And the United States is going to try to do it, get other people to pay for it, despoil the environment. That's what they always did. This is not new. And I want to remind someone of a lesson. And the lesson is that the countries that were able to break away from the global capitalist imperialist arrangement, Russia in the 20th century and China now, are the success stories. They were, that Russia was then under the Soviet Union. I want to remind people, since it's so fashionable not to know this, that Soviet economic growth from the time of the revolution in 1917 till the time of the dissolution in 1989 was the success story of the 20th century. The most backward European country that had to go through, ready, losing World War I, then a civil war and a revolution, and then collectivization of agriculture, and then World War II, still came out at the end of the century having grown faster than anybody else, despite all of those setbacks. Extraordinary story. And China, we all know, is the other one. And what do they have in common? They were not part of they broke away from the colonial capitalist system. They're the success stories, the ones who did not allow what they're discussing for Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan at this point. Now, that's the first thing. The second observation, just adding to what Michael talked about, is I am very aware, and perhaps I am misguided here. I am aware that all the machinations, the 76, because I keep count, the 76 dead people that were killed in those boats, the so called narco boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific. I'm aware that that is a process, together with the positioning of the aircraft carrier Gerald Ford, that is now off the coast of Venezuela. I'm aware that there's a positioning to do a little regime change in Venezuela in order to reaffirm the Monroe Doctrine and to grab one of the great oil repositories on this planet. And here comes the punchline. The Russians, with the implicit backing of the Chinese, have warned the United States not to do that. Now, this is an important, granted still symbolic, but an important step. It's that the Monroe Doctrine has just been nullified. The United States does not have some sort of understood right to dominate in the Western Hemisphere. The Russians are announcing they're here too. And if the Russians are there with ships and navy, which they apparently are, and then the Chinese are not far behind. And my suspicion is part of the attractiveness of having these meetings in the White House is for Mr. Trump to say, okay, if I have to take seriously you in the Western Hemisphere, well, you're going to have to take me seriously even more than you thought you did. Look, here I'm doing stuff right in your neighborhood here with the Central Asian governments. So you do have this geopolitical maneuvering around the very, it's part of the fluid adjustment of the world to the fact that the West is not the dominant economic player anymore. And everybody, the West included, is re-maneuvering, trying to figure out how to stay afloat in this rapidly shifting global situation.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're right to bring up the Monroe Doctrine, because the flip side of that was the promise that Europe, you stay out of the Western Hemisphere, we'll stay out of your hemisphere. And that's exactly not happening. So you're quite right, when you say the Russia and China are saying you've broken the deal. You've come over here, okay, tit for tat. This is what we're doing is symmetrical to your reactions and your actions. And basically, you're seeing Russia and China in this reacting against the West. But again, all of this goes back to the Mackinder's heartland versus the British-controlled seacoast and commercial areas. The whole idea of China's and Russia's, but mainly China's plans for the last 20 years has been to expand overland through Central Asia. There's a whole attempt to build railroads. All of this was replayed in the late 19th century, starting with Persia, when it was the Persian Empire that controlled most of this region. And in the late 18th century, Russia had reconquered what had been the northern Persian Empire, Azerbaijan, the Georgia, part of Dagestan were there. A dynasty, a local tribal dynasty, took over the Shah of Iran, the Khayar tribe, in 1789 and ruled it until 1925, and essentially reconquered this area. Russia then conquered it back, and Russia then used this conquest of what had been northern Persia to extend the railroad all the way through Kazakhstan and Central Asia, further west. further east. Well, Britain opposed all of this, and it fought the Crimean War against Russia to say Russia is our existential enemy. You can look at the U.S. and China today. That was Russia and Britain back in the Crimean War, and the sequel to that was the Anglo-Persian War, 1856 to 1857, over who's going to control the route to Afghanistan, which Persia had controlled, and it was fought over the city of Herat in western Afghanistan. And the British said, we've got to block Russia from getting access to India, because India was still the crown jewel that was giving the financial support for the British Empire, and essentially defeated Russia, defeated Persia, and took control of that. And the next half century, all the way through the late 19th century, saw Russia and the British both asking for concessions to build a railroad through this region, which was still largely under Persian control. Well, they were able to block each other, and Persia wasn't able to build a railroad until finally in the mid-1930s, the state did. It was afraid of getting foreign concessions, and the trauma of British investment all the way from Persia further east was so destructive that there was a general pro-Russian feeling. And after the Russian Revolution, the Russians had the support of the population in these regions, and there was ongoing warfare over who was going to control everything from Persia, that didn't become Iran until later, and Central Asia. And basically the British intervened with the military and settled things by overthrowing the Khar tribal dynasty with the Shah, the two Shahs, the Pahlavi dynasty, the father and the son who did a police state. When Persia granted an oil concession to Darcy of England in 1901, that led to the discovery of oil a decade later, and it was to keep after. I think what happened after that in Persia is what's going to happen in Central Asia. The Iranians elected Mossadegh as a leader in the early 1950s. The British MI6 and the CIA overthrew him, and the Shah tightened up a police state that was so awful, so oppressive, that the only place that people were able to meet to resist was in the mosques. And the result is that there was a Shiite leadership revolution that overthrew the Shah. This is pretty much what happened in the 1890s, when the opposition to the British takeover of Persia's tobacco and opium trade was opposed primarily by the religious leaders, who imposed a fatwa against smoking, and all of the water pipes were all broken, and essentially the Shah, the Khar tribal Shah, who had ruled for 50 years, was assassinated, and the British put in their own proxies. So this is the kind of fight that you're going to be seeing with what's now called the Color Revolution in Southeast Asia. If the U.S. plans for mining and for control and the support of the neoliberal kleptocracy succeeds in this area, there's going to be the same kind of revolution that there have been in other countries. And this is going to be the dynamic that's going to shape the next decade. Excuse me.
Yeah, Richard, really what's going on with the case of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan? They're both deeply connected to China's Belt and Road Initiative, and Russia's Eurasian Economic Union. And looking at the reality of the region, can these countries realistically pivot toward Washington without jeopardizing their existing strategic dependencies?
I doubt it. I doubt it a great deal, and I'll tell you two reasons why. One, there's a part of the history that I can add to everything that Michael just said, which is in Persia, as a resistance against what was being done by the British and by those parts of Persian society that were allied to the British, was to develop one of the most one of the largest and most well-developed communist parties, the Tudeh party, in the world. Uh, this kind of behavior by the West didn't just provoke the religious opposition, it did. And for the time being, that became quite dominant right into the present. But that religious opposition existed and coexisted with a very powerful secular opposition, which in the case of Iran and Persia was the Tudeh party, which had to be ruthlessly destroyed so that the religious opposition could survive. And that continues. The oppositions inside Iran to this day have their roots in that Tudeh party in many, many ways, which the people of Iran have explained to me on countless occasions. So I would be careful, because I think this kind of behavior that we're seeing, this sort of, if you like it, renewal of classical imperialism, it may strengthen in some ways religious opposition, but it will also give a whole new lease on life to a non-religious, to a secular socialist or communist resistance, which has deep roots there. The second reason I expect that is because the ability of Russia and China separately and together to help that Tudeh-based opposition revive is much greater than anything that Russia or China had been able to do before. And they will now have a vested interest in being the support to an anti-West basis that already exists there on many levels. So, yeah, you might re-engage that old battle the way Michael has sketched it out, but the conditions and the strength of the relative players there is not what it was the first time. And so I think now the second time the outcome will be quite different.
Yeah.
There's a very good book that was published, I think, in 2021, called by Bahir Sangera and Elmira Sadibaldiyaga. Pronouncing it wrong. Rentier Capitalism and Its Discontents, Power, Morality, and Resistance in Central Asia. I wrote the introduction to that book, and I'll put it on my website today because it describes exactly the trauma that occurred when U.S. Oil companies came into this region, and in conjunction with the neoliberal rules that sort of have led this region to be more receptive to the Chinese Belt and Road. The Chevron set its eyes on these vast oil reserves, especially in Kazakhstan's Tengiz oil field. And what Kazakhstan wanted simply was Western expertise. It wanted to develop it itself. But what Chevron wanted was control. And that's what the U.S., any U.S. mining company in this region is going to want, the same kind of control. It'll promise the government control, but the way that the IMF and World Bank have imposed free market rules is there's really nothing that the state can do to penalize these countries for all the pollution that they're mining is going to cause, especially for the rare earths. And Trump has said, well, we can get half of America's rare earth needs just from Kazakhstan. Well, that's really crazy if you look at the fact that how long it's going to take to build all of these, how long these mining facilities, who's going to do the refining? Will it be done in Kazakhstan, or will it all be sent as ores are now being sent to China to do? Who's going to do the production? The agreement seems so simple, the way that Trump and the Americans describe it, and they always screw the host countries in the small print of the contract that really said, well, anything you do to enforce cleanup costs and any damage we control, we'll just sue you through the International Investment Dispute Court, and you'll have to just pay us. Not only you'll have to pay us the damages, but we'll arrest your lawyer, like we did for the South Ecuador. I think the lawyer who defended against Chevron's pollution there. We'll just make life hell for you. And I think that I would not be surprised to see Russia and China give a whole scenario of what may happen to these countries if they actually let the new mining companies do to them what Chevron has done. The Chevron promised the agreement 80% of the production, and reflected this 80-20% production sharing, profit sharing agreement. But it turns out that the Kazakhstan ended up with only 2% of the project's revenue. It was a disaster. 2% instead of what it was for all of this oil that it was getting. It was the most unfavorable oil contract that had been negotiated in the last few decades, and Kazakhstan's still living with the aftermath of that. So it has not had a good experience with Western investment. And same thing in Kyrgyzstan. It suffered in a similar way from the gold mining polluters. These also came in, and gold mining is very polluting, as of course is the rare earth and tungsten. And they've had a very unfortunate thing. And the authors, the book that I just mentioned, I'll read what they say. The neoliberal investment rules regime binds governments to agreements signed with transnational corporations. If agreements are violated, investors feel justified to take host country state to international arbitration for damages. The rule of law claimed that the state cannot infringe individual rights and freedoms, and that the domain of private property must be protected from majoritarian politics. So neoliberalism did not get rid of state planning. It turned over what was Soviet planning to the large corporations and the transnational firms in these countries. That's what they've already been experiencing. And I'm sure that the governments want money now. And I'm sure that, as in the case of past investments, all the way from 19th century Persia with its tobacco concessions to mining concessions today, there's all sorts of bribery going on to officials and covertness. That's how the system works. That's the crime is part of the free market. And I think Tony said that not all property is theft, but most theft becomes property. And I think that's what you've seen in Central Asia so far. And it's probably going to, it's the U.S. game plan for that region.
And you have to notice the international law there. They're protecting private property from majoritarian. What a wonderful word. You could have said democracy, but you didn't. No. You got rid of that term and you substituted something that sounds different. Majority. We shouldn't let the majority have a decisive role there. When you do that, all you're doing is postponing the revolution that comes to demand what the majoritarian system was supposed to give you as a peaceful way of resolving these sorts of differences. You have to always shake your head in the wonder at what was possible. And I'm not surprised that the Trump people, what else is their model? They don't have anything in their head but the last 200 or 300 years of capitalist imperialism. What else should occur to them? These are not critics. They're not steeped in a revolutionary or rebellious or socialist or whatever word you want, alternative way of thinking. No, they deal with what exists, the capitalist system, and how they're going to keep it going. And if they need tungsten and if they need rare earths, then they look around the world and go and invest and control wherever it is. I'm reminded of the way the British Empire worked. You know, once the United States became independent and now could develop and discover that in its territory was something that world capitalism wanted. And in the 19th century, what world capitalism wanted above all else was cotton, because the world was learning to dress itself in cotton cloth of one kind or another. And the American South, once you were able to bring Black Africans to work it, was a source of the cotton. And the British Empire was now faced with the fact they have to pay for the cotton because they didn't have the colony anymore. So they would have to pay these Americans. So the word went out in the British Empire that they should work at Kew Gardens outside of London to plant cotton in every conceivable way to see where in the world cotton could grow, that they could harvest for their cotton industry. That's why Uganda is a cotton plantation. Why Egypt is the source of cotton. They tried it everywhere. Where it didn't work, they forgot it. Where it did, they came down with their colonial regime to make sure they got it. And they got a century of really good money out of their cotton textiles by giving the small African farmers of Uganda nothing, and by giving the people, most of the people in Egypt, nothing, and so on. And so we're just replaying that old game again with in new areas with new issues that have to be gotten, but the framework is exactly the same.